The harsh reality of life in most of the 600 plus First Nations communities in Canada is not what we see in tourist brochures or in the colourful costumes that performers wear at ceremonial events. What we frequently see at big city events like conventions and political press conferences is a whitewashed image of what we want Aboriginal culture to look like. Elders, dancers, drummers, and singers show up dressed up, playing their part, blessing this event or that one. The organizers come on stage and dutifully acknowledge they are on indigenous land. Many use the phrase on the unceded territory, unaware that that means the owners of the land never agreed to hand over control of their own land to invading colonialists. BC Mitchell, a former reporter who went on to become the communications manager for the BC Treaty Commission for 15 years, witnessed the reality of life for women, children, and men who live in the forgotten corners of their traditional territories. That's not to say all hope is lost. In fact, BC Mitchell is optimistic that the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada is improving. And while he's hopeful, he's not blind. In his book, Obliteration, he takes the reader into a small northern Ontario community and showcases ignorance, racism, and violence through the eyes of a dysfunctional teen living in a dysfunctional town. The picture is bleak. The protagonist in Obliteration is a young Caucasian Canadian living on one side of a highway that splits this fictional town in two, keeping the Indians over there and the rest of its residents on the other side of hell. Life is not good for anyone. From the outside, life in remote, rural, mixed cultural communities simply looks horrible. It's the kind of town you race past in your car. BC Mitchell, though, takes us inside that world, showcases it for what it is, and introduces the reader to people who have names, souls, and the scars acquired from a lifetime of tragedy. This is a book I could not put down. I've been to many First Nations communities and seen firsthand the horrid living conditions. And I also marvel at our ability as Canadians to dismiss what Martin Luther King described as islands of poverty in a vast ocean of prosperity. How is it that we rush to the aid of people halfway around the world and yet ignore the need in our own country? We sat down with author BC Mitchell for a conversation that matters about his book Obliteration and the long, slow process of healing the relationship between Indigenous people and those who came and took their land. I also encourage you to view the conversation I had with Senator Murray Sinclair on reconciliation. Where to from here?
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome to Conversations That Matter.
Glad to be here.
Your book and the reality of urban First Nations is different than that of rural First Nations. And you have situated your book, Obliteration, in Northern Ontario. When I read this book, at the end of it, I was mad at you because I have this vision that there's hope for the future. Your book leaves me wondering, well, where are we really at? And from your experience, not just as an author, but in treaty negotiations, where are we at being able to start to resolve some of the issues that so many First Nations face?
I have tremendous hope. There is a renaissance going on in this country, coast to coast to coast. To be proud to be an Indigenous person, to be able to recognize your own First Nation. We have made space and they're making their own space for all aspects of culture, which is where they're enriching themselves. Language is coming back. They're finding a place in the economy. So yeah, very, very hopeful. In fact, the book is not pessimistic. There are characters in the book who are carrying on traditions and making sure that the resilience we've seen in First Nations in Canada will continue. And they're resilient, and they've proven that time and time again. Despite all that's happened, they continue to flourish. And the young people, the young Indigenous people are are inspiring. We met some fascinating young people, Ojibwa people, on our book tour. I just came back from a book tour in Northern Ontario. And these people were, I would say, enlightened, both to their own culture and to the culture that they must walk in every day.
So what motivated you to write this book?
You know, I didn't start out to write the book that we see in front of us there. I started out to write a different book. And I've heard this with other writers. They say that characters start doing things in the night while you're sleeping and you wake up in the morning. And really the book started out as kind of a coming of age, living in Northern Ontario, just the experience of being, living in nature. And I was thinking more of kind of just a kid who just loves the woods and loves that life. But the truth is, and with my experience dealing with Indigenous people, working with Indigenous people, my book started to transform and pick up issues of the day that have been relevant, you know, earlier and today. And so things like the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and the inquiry. So in the book, there is a young girl, something happens to her.
She goes missing, yes.
She goes missing, and that was my thought about the missing women and girls. And there are other things, things about land title, preserving culture, the racism, and all these things started to infiltrate my novel, my nice novel about life in Northern Ontario.
Well, where did Constable Parker come from?
See, Constable Parker was just a bit player. He was just really a bit player in the book. And then one night, things started to happen. I woke up in the morning, he took on a totally different character, and he became really an important character in the book.
Very symbolic of relationship between authority
Absolutely.
in Canada and First Nations.
And I'm very influenced by the events that have taken place in northwestern Ontario.
So I've got to get you to hang on for a second while
All
we
right.
take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is brought to you by Odlum Brown, a client-focused investment firm that starts client relationships with straightforward conversations focused on you, your aspirations, and your investment priorities. Odlum Brown has been a supporter of Conversations That Matter from the day we started this show. Their only condition was that we provide a non-biased conversation with people from all sides of all sorts of issues. And of course, we couldn't produce this show without the support of Oh Boy Productions. If you're looking to produce a show like this one, I suggest you reach out to Oh Boy. They can help you produce it, and they can help you build your audience. And we also need your support. I ask you to please pledge $1 per show by going to conversationsthatmatter.tv/donate, because those dollars add up and play an important role in helping us produce this show. Now, back to the show. So you were surprised yourself at the direction that the book took on.
Parker was the biggest surprise. And so then I could say to other people, you know, characters, you know, it's not surprising that characters take on certain roles and responsibilities and maybe failings and traits and everything like that, because you create them and then they do what you would expect a character like that to do. So maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because that's the nature of their character.
So did you start with Ben as your hero?
Absolutely.
Okay, and what...
But his heroic things were more of a recreational nature.
Yeah, but you start off with him literally carrying out a heroic act, saving somebody who was freezing in the snow.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I think, you know, that was his story, and always his, perhaps the biggest question he could never answer, it was why him? And, you know, why did he have these feelings when it was obvious that the non-Indigenous people in his community did not have feelings like that?
No. So
Nobody else shared those feelings.
Yeah. So set the scene for anybody who hasn't read the book or might be interested. What is this town? And I know it's a fictional town, but it is so representative of First Nations and non-Indigenous communities that coexist.
So like many small Northern Ontario communities, Matamiskaman, the fictional
that's
town
how you
in the
pronounce
book.
it. Okay, yes.
Yeah, which actually are components of the Ojibwa language.
Okay.
So there is Temiskaming
Yes.
in the area, and Temagami and Temagaming.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's Matamiskaman. The town is split by the Highway 11, the long straight shot between Toronto and nowhere. And so the reserve is on one side, community's quite split. All the non-Indigenous people, predominantly white, live on the other side. And for most things, it's a cultural collision. These people are not in harmony, they're not in agreement. I would say the Ojibwa people in this fictional town have got the short end of the stick.
Well, as they have had in so many places.
Indeed.
You know, I did an interview with Chief Dan George of Burns Lake talking about, you know, where Indigenous communities were placed after the creation of the Indian Act. And he said, we wound up with swampland. Yeah, we stayed within our own traditional territories, but they put us in swampland.
Playing out this week in the news and last week.
Yeah.
Where communities have been moved to unsustainable land.
Right.
And now they have to be moved again. And it's a common story in Canadian history.
So how on earth can you hope that somebody who lives in that environment is going to have access to the resources that they need that allow them to realize their potential? They can't even have access to employment because there is no employment because there's nothing to do.
You know, and they're caught in another kind of catch-22. They're in a small community. And many people would say, well, why don't you just leave then? I mean, if there's no opportunity there and the community's remote and we can't provide services, why don't you just move? But for them, it's to move away from everything that really ties them. I mean, they have other beliefs that tie them to that land. And like the Italians have Italy and the Japanese have Japan, these tribes, they have their tribal lands. And their language is there, their history is there, the use of the land there. Their traditional knowledge comes from the place they live in. So if you move them somewhere else, like they've moved people across the country, actually, in the north, you're moving them to places that they don't understand.
And to just leave allows the Indian Act to carry out its initial mandate, which was to
take the Indian out of the child.
Yeah, disassociate it from your own culture and assimilate into the greater Canadian culture. And so it becomes counterproductive. And yet, in talking to Peter Calley, who was involved in doing all the studying around education, he pointed out to me one time, he said, you know, I was in northern Saskatchewan in an Indigenous community talking about what had worked around education in a variety of different communities. And the chief of that band stopped him halfway through and said, okay, Peter, I understand what you're saying, but you pose a problem for me. The moment I educate our best and brightest, they leave. And this is a problem. How do we build our own community when we educate them for something that has no opportunity locally?
And we know now that some of them are moving back. Just as some of the professional people in the non-Indigenous community are starting to move to small communities and finding that it's much more livable and it's better for their children and they can lead their professional life there. Educated people are moving back to their small communities, Indigenous communities, because they're finding that they can make a life for themselves there. It's very tough, though. I've met some young men particularly who are struggling with working in their Indigenous community and struggling with alcohol and drug issues and thinking that the safest place for them to be would be to quit their job and move out into the big world because it's not safe in their community. That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. You know, in the book, there's a character who I actually wound up liking a lot, running fast. You know, and there's that one bit of dialogue where they're talking about how much alcohol they had, and he goes, yeah, that might do it. And the response to it was, you got a whole lot of pain going on. Yeah, I got a whole lot of pain going on, and that's pain relief. And that, you know, is the most challenging aspect, I think, when you're outside of it, when you look at somebody who's in that horrible place to be, and think, well, how can you get beyond that? It's got to be a very lonely place. Yeah.
It's you know, I met that young man at a recovery house, and he was asking for advice, saying, should I move from my community where I'm a manager and go out into the world where, you know, my opportunities are going to be quite limited? And I said, you know, you're the only one that can answer that, but you have to do something for your own health, you know, mental, physical. And so he was going to ponder that for a while and try to decide what to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, this book does not paint a pretty picture of life in a small town on Northern Ontario, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but clearly it demonstrates that it's much tougher on the Indigenous side of the highway.
That's my experience. I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario, and the thing I remember is that if you look at my public school photos of the time in grade 4, there was about 40 students in our class. About half of them were Ojibwa. You look at the grade 8 class, the valedictory class, probably wasn't even half of 40. I don't even think it was 20. And there were very few Ojibwa children in that photo.
What happened?
What happened to them? You know, I look at them now and I probably could track them down, but looking at that photo, I can't say what happened to those individuals. Did they just, their parents didn't have a strong desire to keep them in school? They found work to do on the reserve. They just fell through the cracks. They died. I mean, it's all of those things, but they're not there. I traveled, during my book tour, I traveled with an Ojibwa woman. She's the one who helped me with the manuscript. She read it. She is an elder, an Anishinaabe elder. And then she decided to go with me on this book tour. And so we did bookstores and we did library readings. And the way we did it was I would read a passage from the book, and she would provide a personal experience. So she was telling her own personal experience, something she's never disclosed before. It was very cathartic for her. It was very emotional, the first couple of sessions. And she did mention a couple of things that struck me, and I had a hard time being able to speak after listening to her speak. And one was that when she was a little girl, before she went to public school, she realized that she was an Indian. And not only that, she was going to be an Indian for the rest of her life. And they were other. She knew that instinctively, that they were other, and that she would be that her whole life. And the second one was when she was in high school, she was going out with a boy who was on the Huskies, a very popular Northern Ontario hockey team, to be going out with one of the guys on the team, that big deal. And then he came to her and said he had to break up with her. And she said, why? And she was quite surprised. And he said, well, I've been harassed so much in the dressing room, and they're calling me Johnny Teepee. And he said, I just can't take it. And she was really upset with him. But on this book tour, she said, if I met him now, I would thank him because he was honest. He didn't ghost me. He didn't just brush me off. He came and said, this is the reality, and I can't face it. And so we're done.
When you were talking about her realizing at a young age that I'm an Indian and I'll always be an Indian, in my conversation with Senator Murray Sinclair, he pointed out in our education system that if you're a First Nations person, you come through our education system believing that you're inferior. And if you are a non-Indigenous person, you come through our education believing that Indians are inferior. And he said, if we hope to move forward, we've got to change that perception.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can see that too. You can see that people who are light-skinned, and many of them, and I found this in my travels with the Treaty Commission, traveling throughout British Columbia, people who were light-skinned were trying to pass as non-Indigenous. And they would not disclose it if they could, and if they could keep it a secret that they were not an Indigenous person because of their light skin, then they would be better off, and they would do, they would have different friends and different opportunities, and I find that shocking.
Well, that is the antithesis of reconciliation. So in the promotional material around your book, you address the fact that most of what we do in promoting First Nations in Canada is from a tourist perspective. Look at these colorful outfits and the way that these people can dance and sing a song or say a prayer. But you're saying, I want to disabuse you of that illusion. Why is it so important that we do that we move beyond that image?
I find that even more in British Columbia than I do in my hometown in Northern Ontario, because in British Columbia, we embrace the culture, but not the people. So we all have Indigenous art or West Coast art or whatever in our homes, but we turn our face away from the actual people. But embrace the culture, but not the people. To me, I've always found that very disturbing.
And so why is it important, though, that we shine a light on the true reality of the lives of Indigenous people?
Well, I think we need to reconcile. We haven't been able to do it. They're the backstory in everything we talk about. They're always there. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. We could be talking about the economy, about energy, about the environment, about saving species. We could be talking about anything that involves Earth. And we need to reconcile. One of the other things that the Anishinaabe elder said was she had heard from another elder. He said, we better teach the white man how to live or he's going to kill us, which I thought was appropriate.
Well, isn't it true? What I find interesting in conversations that I have with people around our relationship between First Nations and those of us who came afterwards is that when I talk to an awful lot of Canadians, people who were born here and grew up, they wind up with this sense that it's time to just put that behind us and just get on with it. And a common refrain is we should just cut them off and make them go fend for themselves the way the rest of us do, as though somehow that's going to be an appropriate response. Whereas when I talk to First Nations leaders, they go, no, hang on a second. First of all, we have to have a common understanding of what happened, where we're at, and then how we move forward. With this deep gap, how do we create those bridges?
You know, it's interesting in Vancouver because people aren't really aware that all of the traditions and cultural practices are going on right now. Like in the winter, there is the winter dance. There is the canoe. There is still the pot latching. I mean, there are so many things. There is what we're harvesting, the way they're preparing food, traditional foods. There's so many things that are going on all the time that are the practice of their culture. But we're not aware of it because it's all hidden from us. What we see as what a librarian in Courtney accused my book of is what we see as the drunken Indian. And she said that, that my book perhaps perpetuates the myth of the drunken Indigenous person, but I would argue that is not the case, Yeah.
That doesn't perpetuate that. It talks about the harsh reality
Exactly.
and how one deals with that. I was at a situation once with the Vancouver police. I was following them around, and we went on a call with a fellow who was maybe in his mid-30s who was on record as saying that he wanted death by cop. They apprehended him and they asked him why. And here was this guy, and the police officer was very compassionate with him. He said, why would you do this? And he just bowed his head and said, I got no hope.
Yeah.
I have no hope. What a horrible situation to be in.
When hope is lost, what is there?
And yet, in the words of Martin Luther King, how can we live with islands of poverty in this vast ocean of prosperity? Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense, does it? And yet we've done it.
We have.
And it's up to us, and through books like yours, I think, to raise awareness that, we're talking about human beings who deserve exactly the same access to opportunity and the resources to realize their full potential.
The conversations in Northern Ontario are really interesting.
Yeah. Around
the readings. It was interesting to see what people think about, care about in these small towns. Yeah. A real eye-opener.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming in and sharing this with us.